Hey guys, last time we talked about if you need an IP camera or not. Well, obviously for me the choice is yes. So let's talk about some different models and what you need to look out for when selecting an IP camera. And what indeed does POE and PTZ stand for? Do you need it? First, let's talk about something called megapixels. When looking at digital or IP cameras, they often talk about megapixels. But what does that mean? Well, megapixel basically stands for million of pixels. So you have a million pixels. A pixel is a part of a digital image sensor, which can basically record a dot of light. Combining lots of those dots gives you an image. Another term that's often used is HD ready or Full HD, also called 720p or 1080p. What that means is that, for instance, in Full HD or 1080p, you have 1920 by 1080 dots. If you multiply that together, you get about 2 million effective pixels, or 2 megapixel. As I mentioned before, I like using 5 megapixel cameras. The reason why is that the more megapixels your sensor has, the more detail you'll be able to capture. So if we take a camera which is 2 megapixel or 5 megapixel and we use the same lens on the sensor and the sensor is the same size, you'll be able to have more detail in the picture with the 5 megapixel sensor. So most often that means you can zoom in further and still make out a face or a license plate or something like that. As I mentioned previously, I'm currently looking at 8 megapixel cameras. 8 megapixel corresponds to a 4K image, so it gives you lots of details. Having a camera with a high megapixel count can be used in two ways. As I mentioned previously, if you use the same kind of lens or the same width of lens, you have more detail. So you can zoom in further and the picture won't become blurry as fast. The other use is using a wider lens, thus having basically the same amount of detail for each object you had before with the 2 megapixel camera, but now you have a bigger picture, so you can see more at the same time. So now that we know about megapixels, there's another value that directly combines with it and determines the quality of the picture you'll have. Because the higher megapixel count you get, and if the sensor size stays the same, the smaller each pixel will become. And this has inherent disadvantages. Each pixel needs to receive light, and if the pixel is smaller, it's able to receive less light. So if a 2 megapixel camera and an 8 megapixel camera have the same sensor size, and they basically use the same generation of pixel, so they're equivalent in quality, the 8 megapixel camera will have a lot harder time showing you a picture when it's dusk or dim or at night. So that might be a trade-off. So basically we're looking for a sensor that's as big as we can get it and has a high megapixel count, like this mirrorless camera, for instance. But of course those have very large sensors and large lenses and are quite expensive. So that's not going to work for a home security setup. So we need to kind of find the right balance, having enough pixels and still having those pixels be large enough and of high quality enough to give you a good picture during the day, but also during a dim situation and during the night. Depending on what's most important for you, you need to make a selection in that. Now that we know what kind of sensor and how much megapixels we need, let's talk about that POE and PTZ I mentioned. Let's start with POE. POE stands for Power over Ethernet. That means you can run a standard RJ45 8-wire Ethernet cable to your camera, and that cable will carry the data signal, but will also carry the power to power up the camera. Often cameras are hung from the ceiling or outside on a wall, so having to get power and data there can be an issue. So using a modular cable like RJ45 is, you can just crimp the plug on yourself. You only need to drill a small hole and the camera will have its data and power at the same time. I'm not going to discuss POE in too much detail, but basically there's active and passive POE. Passive POE is just using an injector block and then extracting that same voltage at the other end. But this is basically a very cheap method of doing it and isn't suitable for longer cables. Active POE is what is also used in the enterprise for cameras and telephones and access points and stuff like that. And it's always 48 volts. The end device can negotiate with the injector or switch, which is delivering the POE power signal, and it can ask for either 15 watts or 30 watts of power. Using this standard, using 100 meter cables to your cameras is no problem. So if you can get an Ethernet cable to your camera but don't have any power anywhere, use POE. It's a great solution. Someone in the comments mentioned Wi-Fi cameras, and personally I don't use Wi-Fi cameras, but I can see the use for it. But in my case I can always get an Ethernet cable to the camera. Might take some work sometimes, but if it's possible to get the cable there, it's always the best solution. If you can't, but you do have power there, you can use a Wi-Fi camera. And I will link some options for those in the description below. I haven't tested those myself, but from my experience, I think those will be good models. So the next thing I mentioned was PTZ. PTZ stands for pan, tilt, and zoom. So it means a camera can move and change basically the direction it's pointed at. And if it has the Z, it can also use optical zoom to get closer to a subject or get a bigger picture. Most often, newer PTZ cameras actually have 360 degrees of free movement nowadays, so they can be quite useful in some situations. The advantage of having a PTZ camera is that you can monitor multiple points of interest with one camera. It also means you can have a closer look at some points of interest than others, so you can have an overview and a zoomed in look when you want it. Combined with intelligent software, this can actually even be automated. So if it notices movement, it can zoom in on the subject and actually track the subject during the video or during the incident or whatever you want to call it. So that makes PTZ cameras very useful. There is a disadvantage to using PTZ cameras though. You're not going to have it set to monitor its widest view all the time. So that basically means if it's on patrol mode and looking at multiple points of interest, it's going to have to share its video time with those points of interest. So if something happens at one of those points of interest and the camera isn't looking over there right now, you're going to miss it. So PTZ cameras are useful in some situations and not in others. Now that we know kind of image sensor and megapixel count or PTZ and POE we want, let's talk about lenses and how that works. Well, basically, if we take a fixed camera, for instance, the lens will mostly determine how wide the image is that you can view with the camera. If you want to monitor everything within 6 to 8 meters, for instance, that's not that far away, and you have a good megapixel count, you can use a very wide angle lens, like 3.6 millimeters or maybe 4 millimeters, to capture a very wide image. Especially if you place it in the corner on a ceiling, you can look at a whole room like that. But if your subject is further away, like 20, 30, 40 meters, and that's the point of interest you want to monitor, you need to get a narrower lens so that it'll pull the point of interest closer. So depending on your personal situation, get the right lens for your camera. I tend to go with high megapixel cameras and then a wide lens so that I'll have a wide view, but also still have a lot of detail. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about in this video is camera housing. Most of the time, camera housings can be defined in two categories. You either have a bullet camera or you have a dome camera. I have some examples here, so let's take a look at those. This is one of the more bulky bullet cameras. It has a sun and rain cover You can see they actually blacked out the inside to prevent reflections. It has a bracket to which you can mount it to the wall, but the cable is not inside of the bracket. So when mounting this, make sure they can't reach the cable to easily snip it off. At least make them use a ladder or something like that. So you can mount this to a wall, for instance, like this, and then you can turn around the camera and point it wherever you want it to go. On the front, it has a big CS-style mount lens, and I prefer the bigger lenses, although the smaller type lenses are becoming better nowadays. It has a light sensor with which it can determine if it needs to go into IR mode, and basically it switches an IR filter, or it removes an IR filter from the lens and switches on the IR blasters to give you a good picture during the night. So this is a medium-sized camera, and let's take a look at a smaller one. This is a smaller type bullet style camera, and as you can see, it has a smaller lens, and it has multiple IR LEDs instead of several big ones. I like the several big ones better because, in my opinion, it uses less power and it gives a wider spread and throw, so that's good. It also has a light sensor in it, and as you can see, it's a very tiny little bullet style, and it actually has the camera through the mount. So if you mount this on the wall or on a box, for instance, you can completely hide the cable, making it harder for thieves or whatever person of subject that's trying to disable your cameras to do so. Okay? Next up, we have a dome style camera. Basically, these are excellent for mounting on ceilings and even on walls. You can imagine having it on the ceiling in a corner of your room, and having a wide enough lens, like a 3.6mm or 4mm, as this one is, with which you can see the whole room. Combined with this sensor and this lens, you get about an 80 to 85 degree view, which means that in about half a meter or a meter, you see both side walls in the camera. So, with enough megapixel and a sensor that's light sensitive enough, you can see the whole room. And you can even make out details as faces and what people are doing, etc., etc. So, you might only need one camera instead of several. Okay? This is another dome camera. This is one of the cameras I'm going to recommend. The recommended cameras I'll be discussing in the next video, but I will have some links in the descriptions if people really can't wait and have to buy them now. So this is an 8 megapixel camera, and it has one big IR blaster. It also has a light sensor, and well, it's a tiny little construction, and I like it a lot. It's very, very sturdy. All these cameras are suitable for outside, even in the sun and rain. That's no problem. And they all connect with either just the Ethernet, because they have POE, or Ethernet and power if you run power separately. We'll talk about how to mount these and how to make them weather tight, etc. in a later video. Okay? And last up, we have this behemoth of a camera. Actually, for what it is, it's quite small. This is a 4 megapixel 20 times optical zoom PTZ. So that means this camera can, as you can see, it can move, and it can move down, and it can also move like that and like that. This is all controllable in software, and most of the times these cameras will be set in patrol mode. And in those patrols you can specify an X, Y, and even zoom parameter, and then it will just run through its nice little program and turning around and stuff like that. Although this is a plastic camera, these are fully weather sealed, and I've tested with these on a scaffolding construction 20 meters up, and they held out perfectly for several weeks without an issue. The 20 times zoom makes it that you can see a lot of detail even from very far away, and these are awesome little cameras because they don't really cost that much, and for what they cost, the specifications and the image they produce are actually really good. I'll have sample videos of all these cameras, or at least the models I selected, in my next video, so stay tuned for that. there's one type of camera I forgot, or one model type. It's the special camera, like, for instance, this, should be over here, camera doorbell. This model I actually mounted to the house a few weeks ago. I've been using it since. It's a cheaper model, but for what it costs and how well it functions, it's great. So watch out for a separate video where I mount the camera to the house and do a little demonstration. And, well, we've reached the end of this video. This was meant as a sort of general information video, kind of to educate you on what you need to look for when buying an IP camera. Hopefully the information was useful. As always, let me know in the comments below what you think. If you have any comments or questions, they're always welcome. And for people who really can't wait, I'll have the models that I'm going to recommend in the description below. And those are affiliate links, so if you buy something using those links, it'll give me a small kickback and help me out. So, hope to see you guys in the next video. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you guys later. Bye-bye.